Last time you were here, you said part of the problem was it was the marshmallow test that Jay Powell failed. I mean, that is to say, last December, he sort of signaled, no, we're going to cut before we raise, and that you thought that was a mistake because it really loosened financial conditions. Since then, the markets have sort of gotten over the real possibility there may be no cuts this year, and yet I haven't seen financial conditions tighten. So why haven't financial conditions tightened?
Well, because, again, for whatever reason, Chair Powell keeps talking about cuts. Even at the last press conference, he said, I still believe the next move will be a cut. And, I actually think the Chair Powell and Janet Yellen have both hurt President Biden's reelection chances by easing financial conditions last November, December, which we got a reacceleration in economic activity, but worse for consumers, we've gotten a reacceleration of inflation. And the inflation has now put the Fed on pause probably through at least September, maybe through the end of the year.
You've talked in the past about the so-called Trump trade, that is to say, anticipating what would happen if Donald Trump is reelected. How much of that's baked into the market already? I mean, for you as an investor right now, does it continue to make sense to follow that trade, or basically is it already priced in?
Well, I think what's not priced in is perhaps what the administration is willing to do to try to get Biden reelected. So, we saw what I thought was an unfortunate speech by Janet Yellen in Arizona last week, talking about democracy and completely coming out of the economics lane. But, the Secretary Yellen was telling you she will basically do anything to get Joe Biden reelected because, in her mistaken opinion, democracy is at stake. And that hurts the credibility of Treasury, it hurts the credibility of the U.S. government. She is dealing with the full faith and credit of the U.S. government and hurting its credibility when she says things like that. So, but it also tells me she's going to do whatever it takes. Which is bullish stocks.
One of the things we've certainly seen is a very strong dollar. And as you've seen, there's a lot of currency fluctuations. There's this whole ongoing drama with the yen, if I can put it that way, the dollar-yen trade. Is a strong dollar good for the United States? I mean, do you think that's part of President Trump's theory of the case as we go forward?
Look, as long as it's market-based and it's based on, free and fair policies, then, what the level of the currency, should be where it is. I would say now that the Japanese are probably in a bad equilibrium and the yen has weakened. They manipulated the currency with interest rates, with ultra loose monetary policy for more than a decade. Now they've raised rates for the first time about a year ago, and they probably are not raising rates fast enough. So, they're having to intervene. The yen has weakened more than they would have liked. And Prime Minister Kishida, I would guess, may not be prime minister by the end of the summer. And a lot of that will have had to do with the weak yen and the influence that is having on the Japanese consumer.
Well, if there weren't all the intervention that is talked about, as well as some of it done, where is the natural place for the yen right now? Where does it belong in a free and open trading system?
Yeah, it's difficult to tell because it's probably on fundamental values, it's probably 40% undervalued. But I can tell you, having done this for 40 years, if you trade currencies on fundamentals, you'll lose all your money. But this reminds me of the inverse of 2012. In 2012, the yen was the most expensive currency in the world, and it bounced between 78 and 82 for about a year, following the Fukushima tragedy. And so that was 2011, back to the fall of 2012. And my guess is we bounce around here for a while, but we'll probably get a political change in Japan. And I think that if there's someone new in the prime minister's seat, that maybe he will encourage the Bank of Japan, or actually we may have the first female prime minister in Japan ever. He or she would encourage the Bank of Japan to be a bit more aggressive on interest rates.
Talking about money in a different context, again, former President Trump is looking for money for his campaign, as any candidate does, but he seems to be behind Joe Biden right now. You know a lot of the supporters who are already supporting President Trump, but also maybe some people on the sidelines. What do you think supporters, the Wall Street titans that we know, what do you think they're looking for in Donald Trump? What do they need to hear from him to really come in with their checkbooks?
Look, I think that most of all, people want to see that he can win, which we got some very interesting polls today. And I also think that they're looking for a change in terms of what we've seen for the past 3 years. But I think they're also looking for stability. I think President Trump is making a lot of very good economic points. I think that he is also, geopolitically, I think that they're looking for some strength and to kind of calm down the geopolitical situation.